evening and welcome to this evening's talk, The Wordhord, Daily Life in Old English. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, but before I do that, just a few technical housekeeping things. If you're watching live, you'll be able to ask questions at any point using the Q&A button on your screen. This will be available throughout Hana's talk, so you can ask your questions whenever you like, and we'll pick them up at the end of Hana's talk. Should you have any technical issues, for example, if you lose Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link you have. And remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch again if you'd like to. Finally, subtitles are available. To turn these on or off, use the CC live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so over to the exciting business. So I'm delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, Hana Videen, the author of Wordhord, Daily Life in Old English. Hana is a writer and blogger who holds a PhD in Old English from King's College London and now lives in Toronto. And Hana's going to be talking to us today about Old English. In Hana's words, Old English is the language you think you know until you actually hear or see it. And like Shakespearean English, or even Chaucer's Middle English, Old English, the language of the poem Beowulf, defies comprehension by untrained modern readers. Old English was used throughout much of Britain more than 1,000 years ago. And as I'm sure we'll hear, it's rich with words that haven't changed, while others are unrecognisable today. And some remain mystifying to us even today. Hana's been hoarding Old English words since 2013, when she began tweeting a word a day. Now, more than 25,000 people follow these gems from Hana's word hoard. So we can't wait to be guided through Hana's discoveries. So without any further ado, over to you, Hana.
Thank you, Ellie. I will just share my screen now. Hala, everyone. My name is Hana Videen, and I recently published a book called The Wordhord, Daily Life in Old English. In it, I explore daily life in early medieval Britain, food, weather, work, religion, friendship, education, and many other topics. I do this by digging into the words of the time, words in Old English. Today, I'm going to talk to you about why I hoard words, and Old English words specifically. I'll start off by providing some background information about the language of Old English, and then I'll dive into the many reasons why it fascinates me. Some words have endured for over 1,000 years, others have slipped out of use. Some illustrate concepts that are no longer present in our daily lives. All of them give us glimpses of life in early medieval England. Sometimes when I say Old English, people aren't sure what time period and language I'm referring to. After all, any English before modern English is old, relatively speaking. Old English is not the early modern English of Shakespeare or the Middle English of Chaucer. It's the language of Beowulf, written and spoken over 1,000 years ago. The Old English period lasted for about 600 years. Historians tend to date it from roughly 550 to 1150. In early medieval Britain, English was the vernacular, so the language that everyday people spoke, as opposed to Latin, which was the language of learning and of the church. Because Old English is mainly derived from the languages of settlers from Northern Europe, modern-day Netherlands, Northern Germany, and Denmark, it may be more recognizable to you if you know modern Dutch, German, or Danish. Later in the Old English period, the language was also influenced by Old Norse, the language of Scandinavian invaders and settlers. Of course, the language wasn't called Old English at the time. It was simply English or Anglish. Spelling wasn't standardized at the time, and people would write words however they pronounced them. So, how different is Old English from modern English? Well, some of it is actually fairly recognizable to modern English speakers. Hana is min nama, for example. You could probably guess is Hana is my name. Some of the words might be recognizable in the following sentences, which are practice sentences from Richard Marsden's Guide to Old English. that mikle ship werf je fylled med hundem and mannen. That means the big ship was filled with dogs and men. Another example, to morgen etaf we fishas and hlavas means tomorrow we shall eat fishes and loaves. But Old English gets substantially more difficult as we move into poetry. It's also much more difficult if we try to read actual manuscripts of the time as opposed to language primers with modern day editorial conventions. Look at the first page of the poem Beowulf, for instance, in this manuscript that dates from around the year 1000. There's a few things to note here. First of all, there's no title. That's the case for most Old English texts. The titles we use today were, for the most part, created by 19th century scholars and editors. Also, Beowulf, like most Old English texts, has no known author. Beowulf is a poem, but this page doesn't look much like poetry, just a single block of text with no poetic line breaks and very little in the way of punctuation. The transliteration of the first few lines is this. Today, using modern editorial conventions, this might be written like this. Here, the lines have been broken up according to stresses and alliteration. Alliteration is the main building block of Old English poetry, and every half line usually has one or two stressed syllables that alliterate. What we gardina in year dagum, theod kuninga thrum je frunon, Huda Avalingus Ellen Fremedon. The editor has added modern punctuation and capitalization. Also macrons, the lines that appear above letters, to show which vowel sounds are long. These are common in modern day dictionaries, but they don't actually appear in Old English texts. You might also notice that the second letter of the word what has been changed to W. That letter in the original, which looks a bit like the letter P, exists in Old English, but is no longer used today. It's called wun and has a w sound, W sound. There are some other letters in this passage that we no longer use today. The AE smushed together is ash, which has an a sound. And there's also thorn and ev, which make th sounds, th. If I translate this passage line by line, you would get something like this. So we Speardanes in days gone by, great king's glory heard of, how these noble men brave deeds performed. Some of the words might be recognizable now. Way and in are spelled the same as modern English, we and in, and who isn't far off from how. Another possible translation for what, which I've translated as so, is what. So it's actually quite similar, just with the H and W swapping places. But many of the words are still unfamiliar, and even a word-for-word translation makes little sense grammatically. Unlike Middle and Modern English, Old English uses inflection, word endings, rather than syntax, word order, to indicate meaning. If we put the words in the right order and throw in some modern punctuation, we end up with, so we have heard about the glory of the Speardanes as great kings in days gone by, how these noble men performed brave deeds. Now it makes a bit more sense why my first encounter with Old English was in a presentation on foreign languages at an American university. I was a first-year undergraduate at the time, and I was astonished to learn that my own mother tongue could be considered foreign to me. I took a semester of Old English grammar, followed by a semester spent translating all 3,182 lines of Beowulf. Somehow, in the midst of memorizing noun declensions and painstakingly parsing Beowulf line by line, I fell in love with this dead language. I discovered that I could learn so much about a distant era from just a single word. Sometimes Old English has words for things that we don't. for concepts that needed expressing 1,000 years ago that are no longer relevant today. Those words tell us something about daily life in early medieval England. Take gafol-fisc, for instance. Its literal translation is tax fish. Today we are familiar with both taxes and fish, but what is tax fish? Gafol-fisc appears in an 11th century charter detailing the gifts to be granted by King Canute to the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds. The fish that the king wished to give to the abbey was gafol-fisc, fish he had collected as tax from the maritime district. Gafol-fisc is not a common word, appearing only in this particular charter, but its existence tells us something about life in 11th century England. People could pay taxes in fish. If you do some more digging through Old English charters, you'll come across other means of payment. Gafol-bara, tax barley, gafol-wood, tax lumber, and ale-gafol, ale tax. Old English has words that don't exist anymore, like gafol-fisc, and modern English, of course, has many words that Old English lacks. But these aren't always the words that are obvious, like phone and television. For example, Old English doesn't have a word meaning nature, something that people undoubtedly experienced in the early medieval period, and perhaps a great more so than we do today. Many of us live in cities and have to travel to parks or even out of town to witness nature, plants and animal life, things not human or human-made. Middle English natur doesn't appear until the 13th century. And it's not until around 1400 that natur comes to mean the phenomena of the physical world, especially plants, animals, etc., as opposed to humans and human creations. Old English jekund is sometimes translated as nature, but this word actually refers to one's condition or kind, human nature, for instance, not the wilderness kind of nature that we think of today. Maybe the division of what we think of as nature and not nature was less significant for speakers of Old English. Early medieval poems and sermons instead referred to sheaft, creation, which included human beings, plants, animals, mountains, and even entities that we describe as supernatural, dragons, elves, and monsters. And speaking of monsters, that's another word that doesn't exist in Old English. Monster didn't enter the English language until the influence of French in the late 14th century, with Middle English monstre defined as a deformed human being or animal, but also a wonder. The word derives from Latin monstrum, which could refer to a portent or sign. It comes from the Latin verb monere, to warn or foretell. Today, the definition for monster is any imaginary creature that is large, ugly, and frightening. The definition of marvel, or something extraordinary or unnatural, has become obsolete. While there are many creatures in Old English texts that we might call monsters, none of them are actually referred to as monsters in Old English. This brings me to another kind of word I find fascinating, the Old English words that don't translate well into modern English. These words are often lost in translation. Sometimes the word aglaka is translated as monster, but the Dictionary of Old English defines it as an awesome opponent or ferocious fighter. Aglaka refers to human heroes as well as antagonists of questionable humanness. Grendel, the being in Beowulf who lives at the bottom of the mere and kills and consumes humans from King Hrothgar's court, is called an aglaka. But so too is Beowulf, the hero of the story. Translators sometimes translate the word differently depending on who it's referring to. For example, Seamus Heaney translates aglaka as demon when it refers to Grendel, but he doesn't include it in his translation when it refers to the hero Sigemund. Here we see it in this passage. Havde aglaka elne jagongen that heber hordes brukan mosta selves doma. But so I would translate this something like, the ferocious fighter had brought about valor so that he was able to enjoy his own choice of the ring hoard. But Heaney's translation is actually, his daring had given him total possession of the treasure hoard, his to dispose of however he liked. Later, Beowulf must fight a dragon that is ravaging his kingdom, and the poem refers to the two of them, man and dragon, as aglachean. Here, Heaney uses the translation fierce contenders. So the fact that the same word aglaka is used for Beowulf, Siegmund, Grendel, and the dragon adds depth and complexity to these characters in the poem. And when we translate the same word in different ways, we lose some of that. And sometimes the decisions made by a translator can really change our perception of a text. Take Grendel's mother, for instance, who is described as having lathan fingrum. This seems like a pretty straightforward phrase to translate. Lathan, related to modern English loathe, could be translated as hateful, causing injury, loathed, displeasing, grievous, hostile, or malign. Fingrum is simply the dative plural of finger, which 1,000 years later remains finger. So I might translate lathan fingrum as hostile fingers or hateful fingers. However, depending on the translation you're reading, these could be loathsome fingers, horrible fingers, savage talons, or hostile claws. Where did these talons and claws come from? If you were reading one of these translations, you would imagine Grendel's mother as being less human and more monstrous, more animal-like. Similarly, Grendel's mother is called an aglakwief, which is simply the female form of aglaka. Aglaka, ferocious fighter, plus wief, woman. But Heaney translates aglakwief as monstrous hellbride. How does our perception of this character change with a less poetic but more accurate translation like formidable female fighter? Heaney's translation is beautiful, evocative, and a real pleasure to read, but at the same time, it does obscure the original meaning of the text. It's a decision that all translators must make, favoring accuracy and ending up with a clunky translation, or favoring poetry and altering the original text. Ideally, a translation is poetic and accurate, but because some words exist in Old English that don't have good modern English counterparts, this isn't always possible. Sometimes it's not whether or not a word for something exists that sets it apart from, that sets Old English speakers apart from us moderns, but the sheer number of words for a given concept. You're left thinking that 1,000 years ago, some subjects must have been far more complex in their layers of meaning. Modern English has the words blood and gore, for instance. But Old English has blod, swat, dreor, haelver, and soldreor. This image, by the way, is Cain killing Abel. Blood is spilling out of Abel's head and onto the ground where a plant is growing. As for the blood words, blod is the most prosaic of these, with the others found mostly in poetry. Swat refers to perspiration or plant juice in prose texts, but blood when it's in poetry. Haelvor is a bit like modern English gore, blood that's been spilled in violence. Soldreor literally means soul blood, perhaps because the soul was thought to be located in the blood, or because blood was in some other way connected to the soul. An Old English poem about Judgment Day uses blod, dreor, and swat in the space of just 3 lines. Blode bestemmed, heaven kuninges, hlutron dreore, beseon mid swata, that over sida yesheat, shira shinev. As you can see, my translation of this is rather repetitive. Soaked with blood, the pure blood of heaven's king, sprinkled with blood, which will shine clearly across the vast creation. The modern English translator is left scrambling to find enough synonyms. Similarly, Old English has many more words for ocean than modern English, with its limited stockpile of synonyms. Ocean, the sea, the deep. In Old English, there's sa, from which we get sea, but also home, brim, sedge, mara, and watershippe, as well as poetic compounds like udlad, wave path, brimlad, sea path, lagufathom, sea embrace, whaleway, whaleway, and sailrod, sail road. Today we have so many different words for different types of roads: street, avenue, lane, boulevard, highway, freeway, etc. So perhaps it's not surprising that people in early medieval England would also have an extensive vocabulary for their main road. Another word for the sea is this. That symbol, an up arrow with the left arm missing, is lager. Lager means sea or water, but it is also the name of the L rune. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of Old English, the runes. Today we use the Latin or Roman alphabet brought to Britain by Roman missionaries, possibly around the end of the 6th century. The runic alphabet is called Futhorc today, but that's a name made up by scholars in the 19th century, not what people in early medieval England called it. We don't actually know what they called it. You'll see that the first 6 runes of the runic alphabet are F, U, Thorn, O, R, and C. Hence the name Futhorc. Similarly, we get the term alphabet by combining the first 2 letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. What makes runes really special is that a rune represents a sound and a concept. Children learning their ABCs are often taught to associate a word with a letter, a mnemonic device to recall the sound that it makes. So A is for apple, B is for bear, C is for cat, etc. But while you might have grown up associating the letter A with apple, A isn't called apple, it's called A, and A doesn't have the meaning of apple. This rune, however, which looks like laga but with a second arm, is called ash, and it also means ash or ash tree. It makes an A sound. So runes can work as a really neat shorthand for a concept. Instead of writing out ash or laga, you could just write the runes. Even though Roman letters came on the scene fairly early on in the Old English period, most surviving runic inscriptions in Britain date from the 8th or 9th centuries, and the latest ones are thought to be from the late 10th or early 11th centuries. But even though that's the case, so people didn't stop using runes just because another alphabet came along. Some Old English manuscripts have them interspersed in lines of text written in the Roman alphabet. In this image, you can see, you can see them interspersed. So if you count 6 lines down, you can see the rune for L, like the Laga rune, following the word swa. Perhaps it's because they are so multi-purpose that runes stuck around so long after the Roman alphabet came to Britain. I mean, how lovely is it to have a rune like wun, which makes a w sound, but also means joy. Our modern W is just a W. A kind of word that brings me a lot of wun is the kenning. A kenning is a metaphorical compound noun used frequently in Old English poetry. To make a kenning, combine 2 ordinary nouns to create a compound that is in itself a sort of riddle. I've mentioned a few examples already: whaleway, whaleway, and sailrod, sailroad. Here are some other examples, and I'll give you a moment to think about what these 5 kennings might refer to. Heaven candle, heaven candle, banhus, bone house, heavodiem, head gem, sund hengest, seahorse, and gongowavra, walking weaver. So have a think to yourself about what you think these kennings might mean. And I'll go through them. So the first one is the sun, heaven candle. Other examples of kennings for the sun are day candle, and swale candle, sky candle. Banhus is a kenning for the body. Other examples are flash hama, flesh covering, and Wordhord, earth horde. Wordhord reminds us that our mortal bodies will eventually return to the earth, while our souls will go elsewhere. Heaven, hopefully. And heavodiem, head gem, is a delightful word for the eye. And sundhengest, seahorse, is a ship, a horse of the sea. Other examples are sawode, seawood, and uthmer, wave steed. And finally, gongowavra, walking weaver, is a spider. Another kenning is wavra ganga, which is simply weaver walker. Kennings are fancy words found only in poetry, really, and we don't know if anyone ever talked about wavragangas in casual everyday conversation. They might have just used atterkoppa, a word for spider that appears in glossaries, a homily, and a couple of leech books or medical texts, so more prosaic texts. That said, even ordinary prosaic animal words can be entertaining in Old English. In the Old English translation of Alexander the Great's letter to Aristotle, a prose travel account, we have one of my favorite words, hreathamus. Hreathamus is the Old English word for bat. Its literal translation is adorned mouse. It is a mouse adorned with wings, which is adorable. Another lovely animal-related word appears in prose, this time a leech book or medical text, and that is cooworm. Cooworm means cow warm, or the temperature of milk when it's straight from the cow. We might not instinctively know how warm cooworm milk is. It's 38.3 degrees Celsius. Not that a medieval farmer would know that, or need to know that even. They'd be familiar with the temperature of cooworm milk from milking cows every day. Just like we instinctively know whether milk has come straight from the fridge or whether it's been sitting out for a while. We don't need to recognize that it's 5 degrees Celsius, only that it's fridge cold. In addition to coo or cow, there are plenty of animals whose names have stayed the same or nearly the same. You can probably figure out what these ones are. Cat, bever, wolf, horse, hund, sheep, and sween. Cat, beaver, wolf, horse, hound or dog, sheep, pig or swine. But guessing at words that look familiar doesn't always work. The definition of some words have become more specific over time. This phenomenon is called semantic narrowing. You might see deor and think it means deer, but it actually refers to any animal of any kind. A worm could be what we think of as a worm, but it could also be a snake, a dragon, an insect, or even a parasite. Here are some other examples of semantic narrowing. Mete looks like meat, and bread, bread. But in Old English, they both mean food. Leach looks like our word leek, but it could be any kind of herb or plant. These make for interesting challenges when you're reading and translating. You also have to look out for false friends, words that look similar but vary significantly in meaning. You might see dream and think it must mean dream, but it actually means joy, pleasure, or gladness. The Old English for dream, incidentally, is matting, so quite different. Or you might see the word bedhus and think it's a dormitory, a house of beds, but that bed is actually where the word bede, B-E-D-E, comes from, which means prayer. So a bedhus is a chapel or oratory, a place where people pray. Another aspect of Old English that fills me with joy, or dream, is hapax legomena. A hapax legomenon, or just hapax, is a word that appears only once in extant literature. The fact that a hapax appears in only one context from which to infer its meaning makes some of these words especially difficult to translate. For me, this challenge is sometimes frustrating, but ultimately adds to the fun. Gafol-fisc, or taxfish from earlier, is an example of a hapax, although it's from a text that is copied multiple times. So if the same text is copied many times, but it's the same text, this is still considered one occurrence of a word. Another hapax, and this one is one that appears in only one single manuscript, is utchara, which is usually translated as care or anxiety that comes early in the morning. Ut is a time of day, before daybreak, and chiara is where we get the word care. This is one of my favorite words because it so perfectly describes the feeling that you have when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, worrying about issues that you can't do anything about, but nonetheless keep you from sleeping. The word utchara appears in a poem in which a woman has been abandoned by her husband. She doesn't know whether to blame him or to pity him. Did he go away willfully, or did people force him to leave? Either way, she dwells upon her loss in the early hours, feeling sorrow and loneliness. Sundor Yakund is, quite appropriately, a hapax. It means one of a kind nature. That's the same Yakund I mentioned earlier when I was discussing words for nature. From sundor, we get modern English asunder, as in being torn asunder or apart. So sundor Yakund describes the quality of being a bit different from everyone else, unique, peculiar, or extraordinary. Its one usage is positive, describing the nature of the panther, who represents Christ in medieval bestiary lore. Another word that describes the peculiar panther is anstapa, which literally means one-stepper. Anstapa is a hapax for someone who walks on their own, the perfect word for someone who's a bit of a loner. What I love the most about Old English is stumbling upon words that are now obsolete, but that still resonate strongly in my own life. Anstapa, Sundor Yakund, utchara, these all fall into the category of words I wish we still used. To me, they describe concepts so perfectly that don't have suitable equivalents in modern English. Hreadamus, adorned mouse, is such a lovely word, so much nicer than that. And I like spiders so much more when I think of them as wavergangas, weaver walkers. Beyond words that are cute or funny, there are amazing words like aglaka, a word that describes someone who fights fiercely, but could apply equally to a good or a bad person, someone hostile with the capacity for both evil and heroics. An aglaka could be an enemy or a friend in a way that a monster will never be. But my favorite word in Old English, one that continues to resonate for me, is Wordhord. Wordhord appears only 7 times in extant Old English literature, and it literally means word hoard, a hoard or stockpile of words. In the early medieval period, stories were often passed on through speaking and singing rather than writing. So a storyteller in a mead hall would need a well-stocked hoard of words to draw upon in order to weave a tale from memory. A word hoard wasn't a physical object like a dictionary, but a metaphor for the store of words and phrases a poet kept in their mind, ready to use when practicing their craft. Word hoard often appears next to the verb onlukon, to unlock. Various people unlock their word hoards. Christ, the warrior Beowulf, even the personification of wisdom. Words are treasures kept safe under lock and key, but taken out to share with people on special occasions. Obviously, a word like word hoard tells us something about the experience of storytelling more than a millennium ago, but it's also surprisingly relevant. I wrote my book to be a word hoard of sorts. Over the years, many Old English words have found a place in my personal hoard, words that have brought me joy and bewilderment, surprise and confusion. There's even a word to describe the emotion that comes from collecting and treasuring whatever is most precious to you. Hoard woon, hoard joy. So now you know why I hoard Old English words. I hope you found a few new old words to add to your personal word hoards today. Or maybe you're surprised to discover that some of the words you use, like word, haven't changed at all for over 1,000 years. You can find many more in my book, The Word Hoard, Daily Life in Old English. And you can subscribe to Old English Word of the Day on my blog, oldenglishwordhoard.com, or follow me on Twitter at OEWordHoard. Also, if you have an iOS device, you can get the free Old English Word Hoard app. Not only do you get to put the Old English Word of the Day on your home screen, you can hear the pronunciations of words and save your favorites in your very own word hoard. Thanks for listening.
Many thanks, Hana. That was a marvellous window into Old English daily life and also literature, I think, through the words you've been investigating. We have got quite a few questions for you to answer. And if anyone's got any more questions to ask, then you can continue to pop those in the chat. I'm going to start with one from Sean. Sean would like to know about how confident you are that someone, an Old English speaker, would understand what you've been saying to us in this talk today. So a little bit about the evidence, I think, for Old English and maybe how representative it is.
Yeah, sure. Well, I guess part of what that question is about is why do we know how do we know why Old English is pronounced a particular way? And I want to say first off that the way I pronounce Old English words is not the universal way to pronounce Old English words. Old English was spoken over a period of 600 years, and the pronunciations would have changed over that time. And it would also vary based on where in Britain you were located. So one of the ways we can actually identify where a particular text is from is by looking at the spellings used in the manuscript. And the reason that is because there wasn't a standardized spelling for words back then. There wasn't a dictionary that told you, oh, you need to always spell cat, C-A-T, right? So people would write down words the way they pronounced them, which is really helpful for us thinking about recreating the language. Linguists are able to look at patterns at how different vowels and different sounds have changed over time, and they're able to get an idea of like how many syllables a word might have or something like that because of how a word was spelled. And while poetry is not how everyday people were speaking, we do get texts like the Chronicle and Leech books and charters, which are more representative of how people would speak normally. So yeah, I think it's likely that I might be able to talk to someone from, 800 CE, but you never know.
Excellent, thank you. And actually, on a related note, we've got a question from Lorna about different dialects of Old English and how much they differed from each other. So would you be able to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, they're pretty, I mean, there's not huge differences between them. They're pretty subtle. It might be, whether you have a prefix on a word or not. So certain dialects have GE, which is pronounced ya in Old English. Some certain dialects might use that, others might leave it off. There's slightly different combinations of vowels. Sometimes the syllables are like there might be 2 syllables versus 1, but they're pretty similar. And the kind of dialect that we as Old English scholars tend to use as our go-to is what was spoken in Wessex. So that's sort of seen as a standard to learn, but there's more differences when you look at Northumbrian Old English, for instance. It's got some quite different spellings from Wessex.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question. I'm going to carry on kind of thematically moving forward to modern English dialects today. We've got some a comment and a question which I'll merge into one for you. So we've got a comment from Helen who says that in Derry, Northern Ireland, her father uses friends to refer to relatives, which is something you discuss in chapter 6 of your book.
It is, yeah.
So she'd like to point out that usage to mean relatives continues in Derry, and she adds that it can be added a little slyly to mean lover as well. So
yeah.
Nice little bit of information about friend in Derry. But we've also got a question from Rebecca asking about the survival of Old English words in northern varieties of English, so northern dialects. She's noticed from following the Old English Word of the Day that certain pronunciations of Old English words haven't changed very much up in Geordie, so Newcastle English.
Yeah, that's something you'll often see words that haven't changed much in Northern England, also in Scotland. There are words that have kind of been maintained in like the Old English form. They weren't influenced as much by changes when following the Norman conquest and sort of how people spoke, that more of the French influence coming in and stuff. So yeah, when you get further afield from sort of center of power at the time, you get a bit more of that that connection to the past.
Okay, thanks. And I'll change topic a little bit now. So Kitty would like to wonder, so you've talked about some Old English words you kind of love and that you wish hadn't fallen out of use, but she wonders whether you ever find yourself thinking in Old English or even using Old English words almost subconsciously. So does that ever happen to you, Hana?
I'm gonna say probably not. Although there are certain words that I think just because I love them so much, I've kind of just made them part of my vernacular. So Wordhord to me is there's no substitute for Wordhord. I'm going to keep using Wordhord. But yeah, I don't think in Old English by any means, but there are certain words that I think are just so appropriate for certain ideas that they kind of come to me instead of thinking about it in modern English, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so some words kind of more on the tip of your tongue in Old English.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks for that. So, and Jenna has a question about why some of the words that she thinks, something that we all do, like worrying early in the morning. Why have you got any ideas about why Ucht Charu fell out of use, or I guess how widespread it ever was in usage as well?
Yeah, that's an issue with hapex legomena. So a word that appears only once in the extant literature is we don't actually know whether anyone other than this one scribe ever used this word. We just don't have any evidence for it at all. So it is possible that it wasn't used at all by sort of an everyday conversation, but it was used, it could have been a compound simply created by this one poet. But so yeah, you can't, it's impossible to know sort of about that. At the same time, I think that it does tell us a little bit about the culture, about what people were thinking about, even though our evidence is so limited. The fact that people are still sort of having that feeling, you know, it's what literature does for us, really.
Yeah, and connects us to people 1,000 years ago or so. I've got a question from Alex, who asks if there's a relation between gavel, so the tax word, and gavel, I think in the legal hammer sense. I don't know if this is something you know off the top of your head, but if not, how might you go about investigating that so Alex can go away and find that out?
I believe I discuss it in my book.
Okay.
I will refer you to that. I'm pretty sure I have a little section on that, but if I recall correctly, they're not related in as obvious a way as you might think.
Okay, brilliant. So go away,
Yeah.
have a look at
read my book.
Read the book.
Yes.
Super. Okay. Right, we'll move on to I'm not linking them up systematically anymore, but Frances has got a question about words which don't change in the plural, and where I think she might be interested in where they come from in modern day English. So maybe you could say a little bit about some of those.
Oh, you mean like, so words that in Old English, the singular and the plural are the same?
Yeah, I think that might be a good way to, I think that would be a good response.
Yeah. And the question is just sort of...
the question is about words which stay the same in the plural. So whether it's Old English or present English, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think of a modern English example that does that.
I guess something like
top of my head. Yeah.
Sheep might be
all right.
one.
Yeah. I believe that is a feature of Old English that, you know, has it. Sometimes Old English words are not, they don't change form between singular and plural, and it also does that a bit with whether something is the subject of the sentence versus the object, which is another tricky aspect of translating, because there are supposed to be rules that there's inflection, and that tells you what part of the sentence it is and not how many there are, but with some words they're just the same, so you kind of have to figure out from the context what it is. But yeah,
thanks. So this is a feature of Old English words as well, in some of the forms they take in singular and plural and different ways they're used, and so something that English has done for a very long time. Okay, thank you. Okay, my mouse is just frozen, but I'll get back to it. Laura would like to know whether you're considering writing a sequel. And Laura's question specifically concerns what learning about the language has taught you about history itself and life in the past. But maybe you could answer whether you'd be interested in writing a sequel along those lines, and then whether you are writing another book as well.
Yeah, I am working on my next book right now, and it is a sequel of sorts. It is going to be about animal words in Old English. So the whole book will be about different animals. I'm really interested in medieval bestiaries, which are from a later period. So they're most popular sort of in the 13th century, although they were very popular in England. We don't have bestiaries from the Old English period. So I'm kind of interested in thinking about if I were to create my own bestiary of sorts, what kind of animals in Old English would I talk about? What words are kind of related to these? And so yeah, it'll be sort of similar in that each chapter will end with word hordes, but each chapter will be focused on a specific animal. So that's the sequel in the works. And the second question was about how, like what I've learned from history, sort of from studying the words.
Yeah, the question was whether you'd be interested in writing a book about that, but maybe you can say.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of is what I like to try to, it's what I like to try to do with the words, both in this book, and it's just something that interests me in general, is not so much the ins and outs of linguistics, but thinking about what a particular word can tell you about the culture, about the history, sort of how it was used, where it appears, how common it is, why does a word disappear, and why does another one last? So that in that way, it's gotten me a lot more interested in history. When I was in secondary school, I was very interested in languages and reading, but had no particular interest in history. And it wasn't until I started learning Old English that I realized that literature can tell us so much about the past, even if it's, I thought that only, chronicles or, sort of historical documents would be able to tell us things about the past. And looking at Old English really showed me otherwise. That's part of the reason why I enjoyed it so much at university.
Thanks, and you've given us a glimpse of that today in your talk, and we can get a much fuller idea about that by reading the book. I've got a question from Alex, who asks about how you'd recommend starting to learn Old English. And thanks for the talk. How would you recommend starting to learn Old English?
Well, there are a couple books that are probably pretty useful. I'm just looking at the ones on my desk, but there's this is one that came out recently. It's Marsden's Old English Reader. So that was where the practice sentences in my talk came from, and it kind of goes through all the basic grammar and gives you some text to work from. Another one this is an older one that I had, Guide to Old English, Mitchell and Robinson. The one that I originally learned from is in a course pack from like circa 2003, but it is Bright's Old English. But I think that the more recent publications are probably easier to get into. I think there's also, Peter Baker has done some great books to learn from as well, although I haven't looked at those specifically. So yeah, I think working from something like that, and it gives you a knowledge of the grammar, how the grammar works, but it also gives you texts to start practicing with, and it'll give you some easier ones to start with, and then move to ones that are like poetry, which is much more difficult to translate. Ideally, you find a group of people who also want to learn Old English. That's what I did through my postgraduate education. Is there were a group of us who were all interested in Old English, and we would get together once a week, and we'd go through a poem, and we'd just try to translate a few lines of it every week and discuss it. So if you have a few friends who are also interested in doing that, that's a great way to motivate you to learn as well.
Great. So good luck in learning Old English, those of you who are interested. We actually had a few questions about that in the chat. So, and then this may be the final question. We'll see how we go. Joshua asks about whether in terms of geography, Old English was only used in England. Was it used else, or was it used elsewhere in the British Isles or even further afield?
Well, I am not an expert in sort of like languages outside of England. I don't know that much about how it was spread. I do know that there's evidence that people who spoke Old English were in different parts of the world. Like there's graffiti in Italy that uses Old English runes, and it's, you know, some pilgrims who went there and wrote their names on the wall, as people do. So definitely Old English speakers were moving, you know, they weren't just confined to the island of Britain. Yeah, I don't know if that answers it much. And there's probably more travel in and out of Britain during this whole period than I think we often imagine. Like we imagine that it's sort of more of a homogenous group of people on this island, but actually there were people coming from as far away as, you know, Africa and the Middle East who were in England at the time. So there was a lot more cultural exchange than you might think.
Great, thanks. So I think that is going to be all we've got time for in terms of the questions, but thank you to those of you who've asked questions, whether we've answered them or not. And thank you to Hana for such an interesting talk today and for answering our questions so well. So I'd just like to pass on, I'd also like to pass on lots of thanks for a fascinating talk, including one asking how you say thanks for an interesting talk, a great talk in Old English. So that's something to consider.
You can say each say thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
there we are.
That works. There you
go. So there's your answer. Okay, so thanks again to Hana. I've got some closing information which I'll pass on to you now. So one thing for everybody to be aware of is that the recording of the event will be available on the festival YouTube channel. So you'll be able to find the talk after the 24th of June, and you'll get an email when the video is available to view. Once you've got it, go to the festival YouTube channel and then the watch again section. The other thing that you may well want to do now is go and purchase a copy of Hana's book, The Wordhord Daily Life in Old English, which you can get from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And for more information on book sales, you can visit the festival website or go directly to Fox Lane Books' website, which is foxlanebooks, all one word, .co.uk/festival-of-ideas. Okay, and we really hope that you'll continue to be engaged with the York Festival Ideas. You can visit the website yorkfestivalofideas.com for full details of all the events in the festival programme. And we'd love to hear what you think of the events and for you to continue the conversations using the hashtag York Ideas. All right, thank you all for coming to today's talk, and thanks once again to Hana for such a fascinating insight into Old English words and what they can tell us about life and culture in early medieval England.